welcome back to my channel. I'm Jhonna, and this is Jhonna Unfiltered. We're continuing the series on MBTI types as narcissistic parents, and today's type is one that I think a lot of people will recognize very quickly. We're looking at ESTJ, which is known as the executive type. Before we get into it, the usual disclaimer. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist or a mental health professional of any kind. This is my personal learning diary, and everything I share here is based on research and observed patterns, not clinical diagnosis. Being an ESTJ doesn't make anyone a narcissist. Most ESTJs are not. What we're exploring is what narcissistic behavior looks like when it comes through the specific personality style of this type. The type shapes the flavor, not the problem itself. With that said, I do want to acknowledge that this one is heavy, because the ESTJ narcissistic parent is one of the most common types described by adults who are processing difficult childhoods. And the reason it's so common is that the behavior often looks from a distance like good parenting, discipline, structure, high standards, responsibility. These are things most people would associate with being a devoted parent. And when they're used in a genuinely healthy way, they are. But when narcissistic patterns take over, those same things become something much harder to live inside. Let me start with what ESTJ actually is, for anyone new to MBTI. ESTJ stands for extroverted, sensing, thinking, and judging. This type is often described as the organizer, the manager, the person who runs things efficiently and expects others to keep up. They value structure, rules, tradition, and results. They're practical people who believe in doing things the right way and taking responsibilities seriously. A healthy ESTJ parent provides real stability for a family. They set clear expectations, follow through on what they say, and work hard to give their children a solid foundation. The problem arises when those same strengths get twisted by narcissistic patterns. Because when an ESTJ becomes controlling rather than structured, critical rather than corrective, and image-focused rather than genuinely invested in the child's well-being, the household dynamic changes into something that's very difficult to name. Because it still looks organized. It still looks responsible. But underneath that structure, the child has no room to breathe. Let me explain the core pattern. The ESTJ narcissistic parent runs the home like a system. Everything has a rule. Everything has an expectation. And the underlying message, though it's rarely said directly, is that love is earned through performance. When you do well, when you meet the standards, when you represent the family correctly in public, you receive approval. When you fail, struggle, or simply make a different choice than what was expected, you receive criticism, silence, or something that feels like you've genuinely disappointed someone who is counting on you. This creates a very specific internal dynamic in the child. They learn to organize their behavior around what earns approval. They become good at performing, at meeting expectations, at knowing what to do in situations where there are clear rules. But they don't learn how to navigate their own emotional world, because in this home, emotions were treated as inconvenient, as weakness, as something to manage or suppress rather than understand. Now let me go through the mother and father versions, because they tend to express this pattern differently. The ESTJ narcissistic mother is often extremely organized and image-conscious. She runs the home with precision. There are rules for how things are done, and those rules are enforced. She has opinions about how the child should present themselves, what they should study, who they should spend time with, and what kind of future makes sense. And she frames all of this as knowing what's best. She's particularly focused on how the family appears to others. The child is expected to behave correctly in public, to perform well in ways that reflect positively on her, and to avoid anything that might create embarrassment or the appearance of failure. When the child does something that creates that embarrassment, the response isn't concern for the child. It's concern for how it looks. What will people say is a phrase that carries real weight in this dynamic. Her emotional style tends toward dismissal. If the child is upset, the response is often something like, "Stop crying," or "That's not a big deal," or a look that communicates clearly that the emotional expression is unwelcome. Over time, the child learns not to bring their feelings to this parent. Not because they were told not to, but because the response consistently made them feel worse, not better. She may also compare the child to others regularly. "Your cousin did this. Other people's children don't behave this way. This kind of comparison isn't meant to be cruel, or at least it isn't framed that way. But the effect is that the child grows up with a persistent sense that they're measured against a standard they can't quite reach. The ESTJ narcissistic father tends to be more overtly authoritarian. He's the one who has a clear hierarchy in the family and expects it to be respected. He makes decisions. He sets the direction. And disagreement from the child isn't just handled as a difference of opinion. It's treated as disrespect. His version of love is expressed primarily through provision and discipline. He works hard. He provides materially. He sets standards. And he sees all of that as evidence of care. What he often misses is that the child also needs warmth, acceptance, and the experience of being genuinely seen as an individual rather than as someone to be shaped into a particular outcome. He tends to deliver criticism more directly than the mother version, and sometimes more harshly. When something goes wrong, the response can be a long, detailed correction that covers every mistake and what the child should have done differently. It doesn't feel like feedback. It feels like a verdict. And the child often leaves those conversations feeling worse about themselves, not equipped to do better. When this father is disappointed, the withdrawal can be palpable. He doesn't necessarily say much, but the emotional temperature drops, and the child feels the weight of having failed him. Let me look at how financial situation changes the dynamic. A wealthy ESTJ narcissistic parent turns financial support into a contract. The child gets good schools, opportunities, material comfort. But those things come with the expectation that the child will use them in a specific way, live a specific kind of life, and make choices that justify the investment. When the child makes a different choice, the financial support can become a point of pressure. The parent will reference what they provided as evidence that the child owes them a particular kind of future. A struggling ESTJ narcissistic parent uses hardship itself as the leverage. They communicate, often without saying it directly, that their sacrifice has created a debt. The child grows up feeling that their own success isn't really theirs. It belongs to the parent who gave up things so the child could have opportunities. And that debt feels impossible to repay because it isn't really about money. It's about control. When substance dependence is involved, the already rigid structure of this parent type collapses into something much more unpredictable and frightening. The ESTJ, who is normally controlled and rule-focused, becomes inconsistent. The rules that were always enforced with certainty suddenly shift or disappear entirely. And when that structure returns, the child doesn't know which version of the parent they'll encounter. The vigilance they develop to survive this becomes a habit that stays with them long after they've left the home. Let me talk about what children raised in this dynamic typically carry into adulthood. They often become highly capable and disciplined adults. They learned early that competence was valued, and they developed real competence. They're often responsible, reliable, and good at following through on what they say they'll do. Those are genuine strengths. But they also often carry a deeply embedded belief that their worth is tied to their performance. That if they're not achieving, not producing, not being useful, they're somehow less valuable as a person. This shows up as perfectionism, as difficulty resting without guilt, and as a very harsh inner critic that sounds remarkably like the parent they grew up with. They often have difficulty with emotional expression because they learned that emotions were not welcome. Feelings were weakness. So they push their own feelings down, analyze them instead of experiencing them, or simply go numb to them. And in adult relationships, this can create a significant gap between how they feel and how they're able to communicate. They may also struggle with authority figures in ways that feel disproportionate. A manager who gives criticism might trigger an old response, a spike of anxiety or shame, that isn't actually about the current situation. It's about the child they used to be, sitting in front of a parent who made them feel like their mistakes were unacceptable. And there's the underlying question that many children of this type of parent spend years trying to answer. Do people value me for who I actually am or only for what I do? That question doesn't go away on its own. It requires real effort to work through. Before I close, I want to say something clearly to anyone who recognizes their own childhood in what I've described. The structure was real. The material provision was real. The discipline that taught you to be responsible was real. And the harm was also real. The conditional love was real. The emotional dismissal was real. You're allowed to hold both of those truths without having to choose between them or resolve the contradiction cleanly. And you're allowed to set limits on relationships that still operate on those old terms without owing an explanation for it. That's not betrayal. That's health. Before I close, I'd love to hear from you. Have you grown up in a home where rules and structure were very strict, and how did that shape the way you see yourself and your own worth as an adult? Drop it in the comments if you'd like to share. These conversations matter, and your experience might give someone else permission to name something they've been carrying quietly. Thanks for watching. If this video resonated with you, please consider hitting the subscribe button. I want to be upfront and share that I use this text-to-speech voice to tell my stories because, as a full-time ESL teacher, I have to be very careful with my vocal cords. Managing vocal nodules means I have to save my voice for my students, but I didn't want that to stop me from sharing these unfiltered thoughts with you. I'm Jhonna, and I'm currently working toward my goal of 1,000 subscribers so I can finally monetize this channel and turn this passion into a sustainable part of my future. This is my diary of solo living here in the Philippines, and your support, whether through a comment or a sub, helps me keep this channel growing. If you would like to help out even more, you can check out the Buy a Treat for My Pets link in the description. My dogs definitely appreciate the love. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next update. Thank you for being such an important part of this journey. I'm Jhonna, and I will see you in the next one.